January 17, 1945. Saipan Island, Western Pacific. The air in the makeshift broadcast studio smelled faintly of salt and diesel fuel. Outside, the tropical heat pressed down on corrugated metal roofing salvaged from damaged aircraft hangars. Inside, beneath the hum of a single electric fan powered by a portable generator, Lieutenant Mayako Tanaka sat rigidly in a wooden chair that had been carried in from what remained of a schoolhouse. Her hands, small and unmarked by combat despite 2 years of military service, rested flat on her knees. She wore the standard khaki uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army Women's Auxiliary Corps, now rumpled and stained with the red volcanic dust of Saipan. Her dark eyes fixed on the microphone before her, a cylindrical American device wrapped in silver mesh that seemed impossibly fragile, impossibly powerful. Across the small room, a young American corporal adjusted dials on a transmitter unit cobbled together from equipment shipped across 7,000 miles of ocean. He did not watch her with suspicion. He did not stand guard with a rifle. He simply nodded once, checked his wristwatch, and said in broken Japanese learned from a 3-week crash course in California, "Ready when you are, The word hung in the air like smoke from extinguished incense. Lieutenant Tanaka had been taught many things during her officer training in Tokyo. She had been taught that the emperor was divine, that Japan's mission in Asia was sacred, that surrender meant eternal shame, that American soldiers were barbaric demons who would defile, torture, and execute any prisoner without hesitation. She had been taught that women in the imperial military were the mothers of the nation's future warriors, silent pillars supporting the masculine sword of conquest. She had been taught that her voice, her individual voice, was a selfish luxury in service to the collective destiny of Yamato spirit. She had never been taught that an enemy would call her. She had never been taught that an enemy would ask if she was ready. She had never been taught that she would be given a microphone connected to transmitters capable of reaching thousands of her countrymen still fighting across the Pacific, still dying in caves and jungles, still clinging to doctrines she was now expected to question aloud. The corporal raised one finger. The transmission began. And Lieutenant Mayako Tanaka, aged 23, born in Yokohama, daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress, officer of a defeated army, spoke into the American microphone. Her voice, hesitant at first, then steady, traveled invisibly through the atmosphere, carried by technologies she did not fully understand, reaching ears she would never see, saying words she had been given permission, impossibly, terrifyingly, to choose herself. This moment, this single radio broadcast in a cramped room on a conquered island, was part of a campaign that would unsettle the psychological foundations of thousands of Japanese military personnel in ways that conventional warfare could not. It was not unique. Across the Pacific theater, in camps from Guam to the Philippines, from Australia to the Aleutians, American psychological operations units were conducting an experiment in ideological subversion that relied not on torture or humiliation, but on a weapon more disturbing to totalitarian minds than any bomb, freedom of speech. And it was working. To understand why this particular weapon proved so effective, one must first understand the ideological architecture that governed the Japanese military mind during the Second World War. The foundation was kokutai, the national polity, a quasi-religious concept binding the emperor, the state, and the people into a sacred unity that transcended individual existence. Soldiers were taught that their lives belonged not to themselves but to this collective entity. Death in service to the emperor was not merely honorable, it was the fulfillment of human purpose. Women, particularly those in auxiliary military roles, were indoctrinated with an even more suffocating duty: to support the masculine war effort through silent sacrifice, to bear children for future generations of soldiers, to exemplify purity and obedience. Lieutenant Tanaka had internalized these teachings. She had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, partly from genuine patriotism, partly from social pressure as her 2 brothers had already been deployed to China and the Philippines. She had trained in radio operations, logistics coordination, and nursing. She had been stationed in Saipan as part of the administrative staff managing supply lines for the island's defenders. When the Americans invaded in June 1944, she had been ordered, along with thousands of civilians and military personnel, to resist to the death. She had hidden in the island's caves. She had witnessed the mass suicides at Marpi Point, where hundreds of Japanese civilians leapt from cliffs rather than surrender to what they believed would be a fate worse than death. She had expected the same for herself. She had not expected to be offered a sandwich. Her capture had been unremarkable, tactically speaking. After 3 weeks of hiding in a cave system, starving, dehydrated, her small group of survivors had been discovered by a marine patrol. She had closed her eyes, waiting for the bullet or bayonet. Instead, a marine had offered her a canteen of water and radioed for a medic. Within hours, she had been transported to a prisoner of war processing center where, contrary to every warning she had received, she was not assaulted, not executed, not paraded naked through jeering crowds. She was given food, medical attention, a cot with a blanket, And, most bewildering of all, a document explaining her rights under the Geneva Convention, printed in Japanese, signed by an American officer whose name she could barely pronounce. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and profound. Every piece of evidence contradicted her training. The Americans were supposed to be devils. They were behaving like bureaucrats. The Americans were supposed to revel in cruelty. They were handing out ration tins of Spam, condensed milk, and crackers with the disinterested efficiency of factory workers. The Americans were supposed to silence captives. They were asking if anyone spoke English and wanted to help translate. Within the first week of her captivity, Lieutenant Tanaka witnessed something that shook her more than combat ever had. An American officer, a captain whose crisp uniform seemed obscenely clean compared to the rags worn by prisoners, stood before an assembly of captured Japanese personnel and explained, through an interpreter, that any prisoner could volunteer to speak on radio broadcasts aimed at encouraging surrender among remaining Japanese forces. Volunteers would not be coerced. They would write their own messages. They would be fed, clothed, and treated according to international law regardless of whether they cooperated. And then the captain said something that Lieutenant Tanaka would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "We believe you have the right to speak your own mind." This was not how empires behaved. This was not how victors treated the vanquished. This was something alien to her entire understanding of power. The American psychological warfare strategy in the Pacific was not born from altruism. It was born from brutal pragmatic calculation. By 1944, it had become clear that Japanese forces would fight with suicidal tenacity rather than surrender. The battles of Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu had demonstrated that securing even small islands required horrific casualties on both sides. Intelligence estimates predicted that an invasion of the Japanese home islands could result in over 1 million Allied casualties and countless Japanese military and civilian deaths. The atomic bomb was still in development, its success uncertain. Conventional strategy demanded alternatives. Enter the Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch, units tasked with exploring unconventional methods of weakening enemy morale. Drawing on social psychologists, linguists, and Japanese-American Nisei translators, these units developed a program called Truth Broadcasts. The concept was deceptively simple. Use captured Japanese personnel to deliver radio messages to their former comrades, not with crude propaganda, but with honest testimonies about the reality of American captivity, appeals to reason, and personal messages that humanized both captor and captive. The key innovation was authenticity. Early attempts at American scripted propaganda had failed because Japanese soldiers immediately recognized them as crude fabrications. The language was wrong. The tone was wrong. The content was transparently coercive. But when actual Japanese prisoners, speaking in their own dialects, describing their own experiences, addressed their comrades over the radio, something shifted. The messages carried the weight of lived truth. They could not be easily dismissed as enemy deception. Female prisoners presented a unique opportunity. Japanese military culture relegated women to supporting roles, but this very marginalization meant their voices carried a different kind of authority. They were not warriors who could be accused of cowardice for surrendering. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, nurses, administrators, figures of familial and moral legitimacy. When a female officer spoke on the radio and said, "I am alive, I am being treated well, the Americans are not monsters," it resonated in ways that male soldier testimonies sometimes could not. But the American strategy went further than simple testimony. It incorporated a principle that totalitarian regimes find uniquely threatening: voluntary participation. Prisoners were not forced to speak. They were invited. They were given options. They were allowed to decline without punishment. This voluntary framework was itself a message, a demonstration that even in captivity, even in defeat, individual agency could exist. For soldiers raised under a system that demanded absolute submission to collective will, this was a philosophical earthquake. Lieutenant Tanaka had not volunteered immediately. For 2 weeks, she watched other prisoners participate in the program. She listened to their broadcasts played back through loudspeakers in the camp. She heard men and women she knew, people who had shared her bunkers and rations, speaking with tentative honesty about their treatment, about the food, about the medical care, about the strange respectfulness of their captors. She watched American personnel interact with prisoners, noting small details: the way guards nodded in greeting, the way medical staff asked permission before treatment, the way meals were distributed in orderly lines rather than tossed like scraps to animals. And she noticed the food. Dear God, the food. In the Imperial Japanese military, food was a weapon of hierarchy. Officers ate first, and better. Enlisted men received less. Auxiliary personnel, especially women, subsisted on the scraps of scraps. During the final weeks on Saipan, Lieutenant Tanaka had eaten leaves, insects, and roots. She had watched comrades die from starvation-related illnesses. She had grown accustomed to the gnawing emptiness, the way hunger became a constant companion more familiar than hope. American rations were not gourmet cuisine. But they were abundant. And they were distributed equally. Every morning, prisoners lined up for breakfast. Every morning, Lieutenant Tanaka received the same portions as everyone else: canned fruit, crackers, coffee with condensed milk, sometimes even powdered eggs scrambled in a massive field kitchen. Lunch brought spam, canned vegetables, bread. Dinner might include corned beef, beans, rice, and chocolate bars. The quantities were astonishing. The consistency was unnerving. There were no beatings for taking too much. There were no favorites. There was simply food, mountains of it, delivered with mechanical reliability by a supply system she could not fathom. She began to understand something that her training had never addressed. American abundance was not accidental. It was structural. It was the byproduct of an industrial and agricultural system so vast that it could feed not only its own soldiers but also its enemies once captured. This abundance was not charity. It was demonstration. It said, without words, "We have so much that we can afford to give even to you." One evening, while eating a ration tin of peaches in syrup, Lieutenant Tanaka found herself weeping. She could not articulate why. Perhaps it was the sweetness, a taste she had not experienced in over a year. Perhaps it was the absurdity of crying over fruit while thousands of her comrades were still dying. Perhaps it was the slow, unbearable realization that everything she had been told was a lie. She volunteered for the radio program the next day. The process was carefully managed. American psychological warfare officers understood that coercing testimony would undermine the program's credibility. Instead, volunteers met with Nisei translators who explained the goals, answered questions, and helped prisoners draft messages in their own words. Lieutenant Tanaka was assigned to work with Corporal Henry Yamada, a second-generation Japanese-American from Los Angeles whose parents were, ironically, interned in California while he served in uniform. Corporal Yamada was patient. He explained that her broadcast would be transmitted to Japanese forces across the Marianas and potentially beyond. He explained that she could say whatever she wished, though he gently suggested focusing on her treatment, the conditions of captivity, and any message she wanted to send to soldiers still fighting. He did not script her words. He did not censor her thoughts. He simply listened as she composed, in halting phrases, what she wanted to say. Her first broadcast was brief. She identified herself by rank, name, and unit. She stated that she had been captured on Saipan and was being held in a prisoner of war camp. She said, in simple, formal Japanese, "I am alive. I am not harmed. The American soldiers have given me food and water. They have treated me with respect. If you have the chance to surrender, you will not be killed. You will not be tortured. You will live." The words felt strange in her mouth, almost treasonous. But they were true. And truth, she was discovering, had a gravity of its own. Her broadcast was recorded on a wire recorder, played back for her approval, and then transmitted that evening. Over the following days, intelligence reports indicated that her message, along with dozens of others, had been intercepted by Japanese forces. The psychological impact was difficult to measure precisely, but surrender rates began to increase. Not dramatically, not immediately, but enough to suggest that the broadcasts were eroding the absolutist narrative that death was preferable to capture. More importantly, the broadcasts were unsettling Japanese command structures. Officers monitoring American radio transmissions found themselves in an impossible position. If they acknowledged the broadcasts, they validated the testimonies. If they denied them, they risked soldiers concluding that leadership was lying. Some commanders ordered radios destroyed. Others tried to jam frequencies. But the messages kept coming, relentless and personal, delivered in familiar voices, speaking truths that propaganda could not effectively counter. Lieutenant Tanaka made 6 broadcasts over 2 months. Each one became easier, not because she grew comfortable with the idea of speaking against her former allegiance, but because she was learning to separate truth from indoctrination. She began to distinguish between the Japan she loved, the land, the culture, the people, and the militaristic regime that had hijacked those loyalties for expansionist ambitions. She began to see that surrendering to truth was not betrayal. It was survival. It was sanity. During this period, she also began to notice how other female prisoners responded to the opportunity to speak. Some, like her, approached it with trepidation, weighing each word carefully. Others seized the microphone with surprising passion, using the platform to express frustrations they had suppressed for years. Frustrations about being treated as expendable, about being denied agency, about being told their only value was in silent service. One woman, a former nurse, delivered a broadcast in which she angrily declared that the imperial military had lied to everyone, had wasted lives, had destroyed futures for a war that could never be won. Her voice shook with fury. American personnel did not stop her. They recorded every word. This unfiltered honesty became the program's most powerful element. Japanese soldiers listening to these broadcasts heard not polished propaganda but raw, human emotion. They heard women who sounded exhausted, relieved, angry, sad, confused, emotional complexity that propaganda could not replicate. They heard people speaking as individuals rather than cogs in a collective machine. And for soldiers raised in a system that suppressed individuality, this was profoundly disorienting. The symbolic power of the microphone itself became significant. In the Imperial Japanese military, women did not give orders. They did not make speeches. They did not broadcast their thoughts to thousands of listeners. The very act of a female officer speaking publicly, choosing her own words, asserting her own perspective, was a violation of gender norms so fundamental that it challenged the entire ideological structure of military hierarchy. American captors were not just feeding prisoners or treating wounds. They were demonstrating an alternative model of human organization, one in which even the defeated, even the marginalized, had a voice. This was a democracy that America fought for, not perfect, not without its own contradictions and hypocrisies, especially given the internment of Japanese Americans on the home front, but grounded in a principle that totalitarianism could not tolerate. The belief that individuals possessed inherent rights, that voices mattered, that even in war, humanity was not negotiable. By April 1945, Lieutenant Tanaka had become one of the program's most prolific participants. She had recorded dozens of broadcasts, participated in leaflet campaigns, and even helped train newly captured personnel on what to expect in American custody. She had, in effect, become a bridge between two worlds, translating not just language but ideology. She also began to ask questions. Questions about American society, about democracy, about the rights enumerated in the Geneva Convention. Corporal Yamada, amused and patient, tried to explain concepts like free speech, elections, civilian oversight of the military. These ideas were so foreign to her that she struggled to grasp them fully. The notion that a government could be criticized openly, that leaders could be voted out, that soldiers could refuse illegal orders, these seemed like fantasies, utopian impossibilities. Yet she saw evidence of these principles in the daily operations of the camp. She saw American officers argue with each other without fear of punishment. She saw enlisted men complain about orders in ways that would have resulted in severe beatings in the Japanese military. She saw a democracy that was messy, inefficient, sometimes chaotic, but undeniably functional. It operated through systems rather than personalities, through laws rather than divine mandates. One afternoon, while preparing for another broadcast, she asked Corporal Yamada a question that had been haunting her. "Why do you treat us this way? We are your enemies. We would have killed you. Why do you give us food and microphones?" Corporal Yamada paused, considering his answer carefully. Finally, he said, "Because we believe that even enemies are people. And people have rights. If we stop believing that, we become the monsters we're fighting against." Lieutenant Tanaka did not respond immediately. She looked at the microphone on the table, that simple device that had become for her a symbol of something larger than machines or broadcasts. It was a symbol of the possibility that human beings could choose their own words, could speak their own truths, could exist as individuals rather than units in a collective. It was a symbol of a freedom she had never known she lacked until it was offered to her. She made her final broadcast that evening. She spoke longer than usual, more personally. She talked about her childhood in Yokohama, about her brothers, about the cherry blossoms that bloomed every spring near her family's home. She talked about the lies she had been told, the truths she had discovered, the fear and shame of surrender, and the unexpected relief of survival. She addressed not just soldiers but families, women, anyone who might be listening. She said, "The war is ending. We have lost. But losing does not mean dying. There is life after defeat. There is a future after surrender. Choose life. Please, choose life." When the recording ended, she sat in silence. Corporal Yamada did not speak. Outside, the tropical evening settled over the camp, bringing with it the sound of crickets, distant waves, and the low hum of generators powering lights and radios. The impact of the truth broadcasts extended beyond immediate tactical gains. Post-war analyses conducted by American and Japanese historians revealed that these programs contributed significantly to the gradual erosion of the fight-to-the-death mentality that had characterized Japanese resistance. Surrender rates increased measurably after the broadcasts began. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions, often featuring testimonies from prisoners, were found in the pockets of surrendering soldiers. Interrogations revealed that many troops had heard the broadcasts and, over time, began to question the absolutism of their orders. Female participation proved especially effective. A 1948 study by the U.S. Army's Historical Division noted that broadcasts by women prisoners had a disproportionate psychological impact, particularly among younger soldiers who associated female voices with familial authority and moral guidance. The study quoted one captured Japanese soldier who stated, "When I heard the woman's voice on the radio, I thought of my mother. I thought, if this woman can survive, perhaps I can too." The program also revealed cracks in the ideological monolith that American intelligence had sometimes overestimated. Not all Japanese soldiers were fanatics. Many were conscripts, young men who had been drafted, indoctrinated hastily, and thrust into a war they did not fully understand. The broadcasts gave these individuals permission to acknowledge doubts they had suppressed, to admit exhaustion, to choose survival over ideology. Lieutenant Tanaka's broadcasts, in particular, were transcribed and analyzed extensively. Her voice became recognizable to intelligence units monitoring Japanese communications. Reports indicated that her name was mentioned in intercepted radio traffic, sometimes as a traitor, sometimes with uncertainty, occasionally with quiet agreement. She became, unintentionally, a symbol of the conflict between individual conscience and collective mandate. After the war, she remained in American custody until 1946, when she was repatriated to Japan along with thousands of other prisoners. She returned to a homeland devastated by fire and defeat, to cities reduced to ash, to a population struggling with starvation and occupation. Her family had survived, though her brothers had not. One had died in the Philippines. The other had perished during the defense of Okinawa. She never spoke publicly about her broadcasts. In post-war Japan, where shame and silence surrounded the experience of defeat, former prisoners often faced social ostracism. Many concealed their captivity. Many lied about their service. Lieutenant Tanaka chose a different path. She went back to school, earned a degree in education, and became a teacher in a small town outside Tokyo. She taught history. She taught her students that wars are fought by human beings, not abstractions, and that understanding the humanity of all sides is the only guard against repeating the same tragedies. In 1967, an American journalist researching the truth broadcasts tracked her down. During a brief interview, conducted in a tea house overlooking a river, he asked if she regretted her participation in the program. She smiled, a small, sad smile, and replied, "I regret the war. I regret the lies we were told. I do not regret choosing truth." The story of Lieutenant Mayako Tanaka and the thousands of Japanese prisoners who participated in American psychological warfare operations is not a story of heroism in the conventional sense. It is a story of quiet subversion, of ideological fragility, of the unexpected power of small freedoms. It is a story about what happens when totalitarian certainties encounter the messy, undeniable reality of individual human dignity. The microphone that Lieutenant Tanaka spoke into in that makeshift studio on Saipan was a weapon. Yes, but not in the way that bombs or bullets are weapons. It was a weapon that operated on belief, on perception, on the slow realization that another way of living was possible. It did not destroy bodies. It destroyed assumptions. And in a war fought as much in minds as on battlefields, that destruction was perhaps more decisive than any single military victory. Democracy, America's ideological export, was never a perfect system. The United States that fought World War II was itself a nation of contradictions, imprisoning Japanese Americans even as it preached freedom, enforcing racial segregation even as it championed equality. But embedded within its flawed practice was a principle that totalitarianism could not answer. The belief that individuals mattered, that voices deserved to be heard, that even enemies retained humanity. This principle operated through abundance, through food given freely, through medical care extended without cruelty, through microphones offered to the silenced. It operated through the simple, radical act of asking rather than commanding, of inviting rather than coercing, of treating captives not as subhuman resources but as people capable of making choices. Lieutenant Tanaka's broadcasts traveled through the air as invisible waves, reaching ears across islands and oceans, carrying messages that undermined empires more effectively than artillery. They said, "You are not alone. You have been lied to. There is life after surrender. You can choose. You can speak. You can survive." These were dangerous words. They remain dangerous words. They are the words that authoritarianism fears most, because they acknowledge the one truth that no totalitarian regime can tolerate: that the individual exists, that the individual matters, that the individual can say no. In the end, Japan's defeat was not solely the result of atomic bombs or conventional invasions. It was a result of 1,000 small surrenders, each one a human being choosing life over ideology, truth over propaganda, survival over symbolic glory. It was a result of voices speaking into microphones, saying quietly, persistently, unbearably, "I am alive. I am alive. I am alive." And that single truth, repeated across airwaves and years, proved stronger than all the lies that empires tell.